courtroom went absolutely still. Not the polite quiet that falls when a judge enters. This was the kind of silence that happens when the whole world holds its breath, when something occurs that no one has a category for. Every eye in that packed room followed the small figure making her way down the center aisle. 5 years old. Hair pulled into a neat puff on top of her head. A red dress, simple and clean, the brightest thing in a room built entirely from dark wood and cold judgment. Her patent leather shoes made the softest sound against the polished floor, the only sound anyone could hear. John Perkins sat on the defendant's bench in his orange prison uniform, his large hands folded in his lap, his head bowed so low it looked like the weight of the room might push him straight through the floor. He didn't see her coming. He couldn't bear to look up. But Judge Barbara McConnell saw her. From behind the great wooden bench, in the wheelchair that had confined her for 3 long years, Judge McConnell watched the child approach with the expression of a woman who had presided over 20 years of human desperation and had never once seen anything like this. The little girl stopped directly in front of the bench. She had to rise onto her toes just to press her small hands flat against the wood. She looked up, past the towering desk, past the black robes, past every symbol of power and authority in the room, and looked the judge directly in the eyes. Her voice was clear, steady, impossibly certain for a child who barely came up to the railing. "If you let my daddy go free," Debra Perkins said, "I promise I will make your legs work again." The room exploded. Our prosecutor, Jeremy Clinton, let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. People in the gallery whispered and pointed. Someone near the back shook their head. A court officer took a half-step forward, unsure whether to remove her. The mockery moved through the crowd like a wave. Because what else do adults do when a child says something that breaks every rule they've ever believed in? But Judge Barbara McConnell did not laugh. She sat very still, and she stared at this tiny girl in the red dress with an expression no one in that courtroom could quite read, because something had just happened inside her chest, something she had no legal language for, no precedent to cite, no rational explanation to offer. She felt it when the child's hands touched the wood of her bench. Something warm, something that had no business being there. I know, now, before I tell you what the judge decided and what happened in the 30 days that followed, let me take you back to where this story truly begins. Because to understand why a 5-year-old girl walked into a courtroom and made an impossible promise to a paralyzed judge, you first have to understand what kind of man John Perkins is and what a father will do when the law cannot save the only person he has left. And you need to know what Debra's gift actually costs her. Because by the time this story ends, one of them will be walking again. But only one of them. Where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what happens next. Before I tell you what happened next, if you are the kind of person who believes that a father's love and a little girl's faith can move things that logic says are immovable, this channel was made for you. Hit subscribe right now and stay with us. Because what Debra does will either restore your faith in something greater than this world or break your heart completely. Possibly both. John Perkins learned the language of hard things early. Not the kind of hard that breaks a man all at once, but the slow, grinding kind. The kind that lives in the lower back after 10 hours of swinging a sledgehammer in August heat. The kind that settles into the knuckles, into the calluses, into the permanent dust that never quite washes out from beneath the fingernails, no matter how long you stand at the sink. He had worked construction since he was 19 years old. Started as a sight runner, fetching water, moving lumber, doing whatever the older men pointed at. By 25, he could read a blueprint it the way other men read a newspaper. By 30, he was the one the foreman called when something needed to be done right and done once. John Perkins was not a man who complained. He was not a man who asked for much. He believed, us with the quiet stubbornness of someone who had never been handed anything, that if you showed up and you worked and you kept your word, the world would eventually meet you somewhere fair. Then Ava got sick, and the world stopped pretending to be fair. Ava Buckles had laughed at everything. That was the first thing John ever noticed about her, the way she found something worth smiling at in rooms where nobody else could. She laughed at the leaking faucet in their first apartment. She laughed at the second-hand crib they assembled wrong 3 times before Debra finally came home to sleep in it. Even in the hospital, in those last slow months, she would look at John with tired eyes and find some small thing to laugh about, as if she was trying to leave him a supply of it, as if she knew he would need it after she was gone. Debra was 3 years old when Eva passed. Too young to understand what the quiet in the apartment meant. Too young to know why her father sometimes stood at the kitchen window for a long time without moving, just staring at nothing, his coffee going cold in his hand. John never told Debra that he cried. He did it in the truck before he came inside. He gave himself exactly as long as it took to drive home from the job site. And then he dried his face, climbed the stairs, and became the only parent she had left. He packed her lunch every morning. He learned to do her hair, badly at first, then with a patience that surprised even him. He worked doubles when the overtime was available and saved every dollar that wasn't already spoken for. He told her every single night before she slept, and that she was loved and she was safe, and that nothing in this world was going to touch her. He believed it when he said it. He had no way of knowing that the thing coming for his daughter was already there, quiet and invisible, living in her blood. And that by the time he understood what he was up against, the only tools he had left wouldn't be enough. But that comes later. First, there was just a man, a good man, going to work. The prescription cost $312. John knew the number by heart because he had stood at that same pharmacy counter 4 times in the past 2 months, each time sliding his debit card across with the particular stillness of a man who already knows what the machine is going to say. Declined. Insufficient funds. He would nod, put the card back in his wallet, and walk out into the parking lot to sit in his truck and do the math again, as if the numbers might rearrange themselves if he just stared at them long enough. They never did. Debra's condition had a name that took up half a page in the pamphlet the doctor gave him. What it meant, in plain language, was that her body was fighting itself, had been fighting itself since before she could walk. The medicine didn't cure anything. It just kept her comfortable, kept the worst of it quiet, bought her ordinary days instead of bad ones. Without it, the bad days came faster, and they stayed longer. He could hear it in her breathing at night when he stood outside her bedroom door. A sound no father should have to learn to recognize. He had already sold Eva's jewelry. He had already borrowed from his foreman, twice, and was too ashamed to go back a 3rd time. He had called every assistance program the hospital social worker listed on a yellow sticky note and been placed on waiting lists for all of them. The construction site had slowed down for the season. The overtime was gone, and Debra needed her medicine. He told himself he would pay it back. He had already decided exactly how. He would work an extra Saturday, put it in an envelope, leave it at the pharmacy counter anonymously. It wasn't stealing, not really. It was borrowing from a corporation that charged $312 for something his daughter needed to breathe. He rehearsed this argument in the truck until it sounded reasonable, until it sounded like something a good man could do. Harrington's pharmacy was on Clement Street, 3 blocks from their apartment. Jimmy Harrington had owned it for 22 years, and he ran it the way he ran everything. Close, careful, and with a set of eyes that missed nothing. John had barely gotten the blister pack beneath his jacket when he felt the hand on his shoulder. Not rough, just certain. "Son?" Jimmy Harrington said quietly, so the other customers wouldn't hear. "Come on to the back with me." John didn't run. He didn't argue. He just looked down at the small package in his hand. This ordinary, unremarkable thing that his daughter needed to get through a Tuesday, and felt something collapse inside him that he wasn't sure he could ever rebuild. They called the police from the back office. John sat in a plastic chair and waited. He didn't cry. He just kept thinking about who was going to make Debra's breakfast in the morning. Did you know that 1 in 4 families in America struggle to afford life-saving prescriptions, even with insurance? If you were standing exactly where John stood, would you have done the same thing? Type yes or no in the comments. There's no wrong answer here. Courtroom 7 had a reputation. Not the kind that gets written down anywhere, but the kind that moves through the hallways of the Justice Building in whispers. The kind that makes public defenders straighten their ties before walking in. It was Judge Barbara McConnell's courtroom, and in 20 years on the bench, she had built something close to a legend. Not for cruelty exactly, for exactness. For the particular brand of patience she had with the law and the particular lack of it she had for anything that wasted her time. Emotion, she had been known to say, was not evidence. She sat behind her bench in her black robes, her reading glasses low on her nose, her wheelchair positioned with the same quiet authority as the great wooden desk itself. 3 years in that chair had not softened her. If anything, it had sharpened her. As if the stillness forced upon her body had driven everything inward, concentrating into a focus so precise it could cut glass. John Perkins stood when they told him to stand. He wore his orange uniform and his dignity as best he could, which wasn't very well. The courtroom smelled like wood polish and old decisions. Prosecutor Jeremy Clinton laid out the case in clean, efficient language. Theft of pharmaceutical goods, value exceeding $200. Prior warnings on record from a noise complaint 2 years ago that had nothing to do with any of this, but sounded like pattern when you said it the right way. Clinton was good at his job. He made a man who had stolen medicine for his sick daughter sound like a man the neighborhood should be protected from. Judge McConnell listened without expression. She asked 2 questions, noted 2 answers, and wrote something down. John's public defender, a young woman named Carla Price, who had been practicing for 14 months, made the case for leniency with genuine feeling and very little legal leverage. The judge heard her out in silence. "Mr. Perkins," Judge McConnell said, removing her glasses, "the law does not grade desperation. It grades behavior, and yours—" She stopped. Not because she had lost her thought, because something had changed in the room. A small sound, a soft, rhythmic squeak of patent leather shoes against polished floor, moving in a direction no one had authorized. Every head turned. Debra had slipped from the gallery bench where the social worker had been watching her. She was walking down the center aisle with the particular determination of a child who has made up her mind about something and sees no reason to discuss it further. Her red dress, her hair in its neat puff, her chin level, her eyes fixed on one thing only. She stopped at the bench, rose onto her toes, pressed both small hands flat against the wood, and the most precise woman in the building forgot, for just a moment, what she had been about to say. Nobody moved. For a long moment, the entire courtroom existed in a kind of suspended state. Jeremy Clinton with his pen frozen above his legal pad, Carla Price with her hand half raised, John Perkins with his eyes finally lifted from the floor, and his face doing something it hadn't done since the trial began. Something that looked dangerously close to hope. Debra looked up at Judge McConnell, the way children look at things they are not afraid of. Directly, openly, without the learned embarrassment that adults carry into rooms like this one. Her small hands were still flat on the bench. Her voice, when it came, was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the room. "If you let my daddy go free, I promise I will make your legs work again." The laughter started somewhere in the middle of the gallery and spread fast, in the way embarrassed laughter always does. Nervous and a little mean, the sound people make when something has moved them, and they don't want to admit it. Jeremy Clinton didn't laugh, but he smiled, which was worse. He rose from his seat with the patience of a man who had already won. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "perhaps we can have the child removed so we can return to the—" "Sit down, Mr. Clinton." The smile disappeared. Judge McConnell had not taken her eyes off Debra. She was leaning forward slightly now, her elbows on the bench, her reading glasses held loosely in one hand. Whatever calculation was happening behind those gray eyes, it was not the kind that could be rushed. She studied the child for a long time, long enough that the gallery went quiet again, long enough that John Perkins gripped the edge of the defendant's table without realizing he was doing it. Then Judge Barbara McConnell, who had not ruled on feeling in 20 years, did something that would be discussed in the hallways of that building for a very long time afterward. She granted a 30-day stay of sentencing. The room came apart. Clinton was on his feet immediately, his composure cracking at the edges, his voice climbing in a way that wasn't quite professional. Irregular, unprecedented, a mockery of judicial process. Judge McConnell let him speak. She waited until he had finished, and the echo of his objection had settled into the wood of the walls. "The stay is granted," she said simply. 30 days, and at which point we will reconvene and I will render my judgment in full." She looked at Clinton with the expression of a woman who has already moved on. "Are we done?" They were done. John was escorted back to holding in a kind of daze. Debra was collected gently by the social worker, her small hand wrapped around the woman's fingers. At the door, she turned back, just once, and looked toward the bench. Judge McConnell was still watching her. In law, a stay of execution is a court order that temporarily halts a legal judgment or sentence. It doesn't erase the case, it pauses it. What do you think? Was Judge McConnell being a wise judge who followed her instincts, or a reckless one who let a child walk into her courtroom and change the law? Tell us what you think in the comments. Judge Barbara McConnell lived in a house that had learned to accommodate her. The door frames had been widened, the kitchen counters lowered on one side. The thick Persian rugs she had collected over 30 years of careful living had been rolled up and stored in the basement because wheels catch on edges and edges become falls. The house was still beautiful, ordered, tasteful, full of books. But it had the particular quality of a place that has been quietly grieved over, adjusted for a life that wasn't supposed to go this way. Debra walked through the front door and said nothing for a long time. She moved slowly, the way she always did in new places, as if she was listening to something the walls were saying. The social worker, Ms. Paulette, sat near the entrance with her clipboard and her professional neutrality. Judge McConnell followed Debra's progress through the front room in her chair, watching without speaking, which was itself a kind of concession. Barbara McConnell was not a woman comfortable with silence she hadn't chosen. Debra stopped in the hallway. There was a framed photograph on the wall, the judge at some formal dinner years ago, standing at a podium, caught mid-laugh in a way the camera had no business capturing. both legs beneath her, a glass of something sparkling in her hand. "You were happy there," Debra said. Not a question. "I was," the judge said after a moment. Debra looked at the photograph for another long beat, then turned to face her. "Can I sit next to you?" They settled in the study, Debra cross-legged on the ottoman, close enough that her knees almost touched the wheel of the chair. She reached out without asking and rested her small hand over the judge's hand where it lay on the armrest. The judge stiffened slightly, the reflex of a woman unaccustomed to being touched without warning. But she didn't pull away. Debra closed her eyes. What happened next was not dramatic. There was no light, no sound, no visible thing that Miss Paulette could have written on her clipboard. But Judge McConnell felt something move through her. A pressure, almost, like the shift in temperature before weather changes. And with it came an image she had not let herself think about in 3 years. The intersection on Millbrook Avenue, the rain, the other car appearing from nowhere on her left side, the sound of it. And then the long, terrible silence of the hospital ceiling above her when she finally woke up and understood, from the way the nurses moved, that something permanent had happened. She realized her eyes were wet. Debra opened her eyes and looked at her steadily, without pity. Pity would have been easier to bear. "It wasn't your fault," the child said simply. "You know that, right?" Barbara McConnell, who had not cried in front of another person in 20 years, looked away toward the window and said nothing, which was answer enough. It was Debra's idea to go to the park. She had asked on a Tuesday, plainly, the way she asked for most things. Without performance, without the manipulative sweetness some children deploy when they want something. She just looked at Judge McConnell across the study where they had taken to meeting every few days and said, "There's a park on Dunmore Street with a fountain. Can we go there Saturday?" And because Barbara McConnell was becoming, without entirely meaning to, a woman who found it difficult to say no to this particular child, they went. It had rained the night before. The morning was clean and cool, the kind of October air that smells like wet bark and distant wood smoke. The park was nearly empty at that hour. A man walked a dog along the far path. 2 pigeons negotiated aggressively over something near the fountain. Debra moved ahead of the wheelchair at her usual unhurried pace, pausing to inspect things. A leaf caught in a crack in the pavement, the fountain's edge, a small brown sparrow that held its ground far longer than it should have. The judge watched her from the path. She had been watching Debra the way you watch something you cannot explain but are no longer afraid of. In the 2 weeks since the girl had sat beside her in the study and said it wasn't your fault, something had shifted in the house, not dramatically. The way a window shifts when you open it after a long winter. The same room, the same furniture, but the air entirely different. They stopped near the fountain. Debra climbed up to sit on the stone edge, her legs dangling, and looked out at the water with that expression she sometimes wore. Present, but also listening to something just beyond the frequency of ordinary sound. Then she reached down and placed both hands on top of the judge's, where they rested on her knees. "Just sit still," she said softly. "Don't think about anything." Barbara McConnell had spent 30 years thinking about everything. But she closed her eyes. It started below the knee. A warmth, not painful, not startling. Something gentler than either of those things. Like the first real day of spring when the sun finally means it. It moved upward slowly, tracing paths that had been silent for 3 years, waking nerve endings the specialists had been careful not to promise would ever respond again. Her breath caught. Her hands turned beneath Debra's and gripped them without meaning to. I feel, she started. I know, Debra said quietly. The warmth held for a long moment, then faded to a low hum. When the judge opened her eyes, the park looked exactly the same. But something inside her body had remembered something it had been trying to forget. She looked at Debra, who was watching the fountain again, calm as still water. Already a little more tired than she had been an hour ago. The judge noticed. She filed it away without speaking. Research shows that hope isn't just emotional. It can physically lower cortisol levels, reduce inflammation, and measurably improve recovery outcomes in patients. What is the one thing that gives you hope when everything feels impossible? Share your story in the comments. Someone out there needs to read it today. It happened on a Wednesday evening, which is the kind of unremarkable detail that makes tragedy worse. Barbara McConnell had been trying to reach a book on the second shelf, a volume of case law she had referenced 100 times before the accident, shelved in the years when reaching was effortless. She knew better. Some part of her had always known better. But the warmth in her legs had been returning in small, stubborn increments since the park. And something in her had begun to believe, quietly and without permission, that she was becoming herself again. She had leaned. The chair had shifted on the hardwood. And then the floor had come up to meet her with a speed that left no time for anything except the sound of it. She was found by her housekeeper 40 minutes later. The hospital used words like secondary trauma and spinal episode and precautionary monitoring, which is how doctors say, "We are frightened," without saying we are frightened. They settled her into the ICU and called her emergency contacts and adjusted the machines and did everything that could be done, which in cases like hers had limits that everyone in the room understood without stating. Ms. Paulette brought Debra the following morning. It was not strictly permitted. The floor supervisor made her case firmly and professionally, and was overruled by something in the child's expression that she could not find the appropriate regulation to address. Debra walked into the room, set her small jacket on the chair by the window, and climbed up onto the visitor's stool beside the bed without asking anyone for anything. She took the judge's hand. She didn't pray or speak or perform anything that could be documented in a medical chart. She simply sat, hour after hour, through the beeping of monitors and the soft footsteps of nurses and the long, antiseptic afternoon. Ms. Paulette brought her crackers at noon. She ate 2 of them and set the rest aside and went back to holding the judge's hand. By the 3rd hour, the nurses had begun to notice something they mentioned to each other only in the break room, in low voices, with the careful tone people use when they are reporting something they cannot explain. The judge's readings, blood pressure, oxygen saturation, the subtle neurological markers they had been watching with held breath, were stabilizing, then improving. Slowly, improbably, moving in the direction no one had confidently predicted. And Debra, across the bed rail, was moving in the other direction. Her face had taken on a quality that had no clinical name, a thinning, almost as if something was passing through her outward and away. The color left her the way light leaves a room at the end of a winter afternoon. Gradual, inevitable, too quiet to stop. Ms. Paulette sat in the corner and watched and said nothing. Because some things you cannot interrupt, even when you know, somewhere beneath your professional training and your better judgment, that you are watching a child spend something she cannot afford to spend, and that she knows it, and is choosing to anyway. Barbara McConnell woke at 4:47 in the morning. Not gradually, the way the medicated drift back into consciousness, but cleanly, completely, as if a switch had been thrown somewhere deep in her body. The room was dark except for the pale glow of the monitors. The machines were quiet. The IV in her arm caught a thin line of light from the hallway. She lay still for a moment, taking inventory the way she always did now. The familiar absence below the waist. The absence that had become, in 3 years, as much a part of her as anything else. A negative space she had learned to navigate, to plan around, to stop grieving out loud, even when she hadn't stopped grieving entirely. She thought about Debra. She didn't know why exactly. Only that the child had been there when she fell asleep, her small hand warm over the judge's, and was not there now. The visitor's stool by the window was empty. The small jacket was gone from the chair. Barbara McConnell looked down at her feet beneath the hospital blanket. She thought about the park, the fountain, the warmth that had moved through her like a slow tide coming in. She thought about the study and the photograph in the hallway, and the child's voice saying, "It wasn't your fault," with a certainty that had no business living inside a 5-year-old. She concentrated. The way you concentrate on something you have been told, repeatedly and by experts, to stop hoping for. The big toe on her left foot moved. It was small, it was slight, or it was the most significant thing that had happened in the same body that had delivered 20 years of verdicts and survived a car accident on a rainy Tuesday and raised itself back up after every defeat that life had found to deliver. She made a sound she would never describe to anyone. Not quite a cry, not quite a word, and pressed the call button with a shaking hand. The nurse came, then another, then the attending physician, still pulling on his coat, who stood at the foot of the bed and asked her to do it again, and then stood very quietly for a moment with his hand over his mouth. Nobody noticed, in the controlled commotion of the next 20 minutes, that a child was not where a child was supposed to be. It was a different nurse who found her. In the hallway near the elevator bank, you were 12 steps from the door of room 114. As if she had made it that far and then simply run out of whatever had been keeping her upright. She was on the floor with her knees folded beneath her, her head tilted against the wall, her face the color of winter sky. Her breathing was there, shallow and slow and there. But her eyes were closed, and they would not open. The alarm that went out over the hospital intercom used calm, coded language. But the nurses who ran toward that hallway ran the way people run when calm language is all that's standing between them and the truth. True sacrifice is not giving what you can spare. It is giving what you cannot afford to lose, and giving it anyway for someone else's sake. Who is the most selfless person you have ever known? Tag them in the comments or tell us their story. They deserve to be seen. She walked into the prison on a Thursday morning, slowly, with a cane, dark wood, held in her right hand. Each step deliberate and earned in a way that steps had never been before. Not something she could take for granted. Not something she could do without thinking. She felt the floor beneath her feet with the full attention of a woman who understood, now, exactly what that feeling had cost. The corrections officer at the front desk recognized her. He stood without meaning to. His eyes went to the cane, then to her face, and he had the good sense not to say anything about either. She had filed the paperwork herself. Charges dismissed, judicial discretion, time served, extenuating circumstances that she had written into the record with the careful, unassailable language of 20 years on the bench. Jeremy Clinton had objected in a formal letter that she had read once and placed in a drawer. The law, when you knew it well enough, contained room for mercy. You simply had to be willing to find it. John Perkins was brought to the discharge room at 9 in the morning. He was still in his orange uniform, his personal effects in a clear plastic bag, his wallet, his phone, his keys. He walked in looking the way men look when they have been inside long enough to forget how to expect good news. Cautious. Braced. He saw the cane first. Then he saw her face. Judge Barbara McConnell was standing. She was standing on her own 2 feet in the middle of a room that smelled like industrial cleaner and old fluorescent light. And there were tears running down her face that she was making no effort to stop or explain. John understood before she spoke, the way you understand certain things. Not in your mind first, but somewhere older than that. His hand found the edge of the table. She told him quietly. All of it. The hallway, the floor near the elevator, the 3 days that followed in which the doctors had used every term available to them for a child who was present in body, but had gone somewhere they could not reach. The small face against the pillow. The red dress, folded by a nurse and left on the chair beside the bed. John Perkins did not collapse. He stood. He absorbed it the way men absorb the unsurvivable, by going very still, by breathing, by staying upright through pure, terrible will. A sound came from him that was not a word. Then silence. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, the same way Debra had done. And she stood there on the legs that a little girl had purchased with everything she had. And she did not let go. That evening, a neighbor heard nothing from the apartment on the 3rd floor of the building on Clement Street. John Perkins sat in Debra's room for a long time. The lamp on the small dresser was on. Her drawings were still taped to the wall. Lopsided suns, a house with too many windows, a man in a hard hat that was supposed to be him. Her shoes were by the door. The red dress was in his hands, small, soft, still faintly warm, the way things are when they have recently held someone. He held it for a long time. He didn't pray. He didn't speak. He just sat in the quiet of the room his daughter had lived in, with the things she had worn on the day she walked into a courtroom and changed 2 lives, one of them completely, and one of them forever. Outside the window, somewhere on the street below, the city went on doing what cities do. Indifferent, ordinary, alive. And somewhere across town, a woman stood at her kitchen window in the dark, her cane leaning against the counter she no longer needed it to reach. She stood on her own 2 feet and looked out at nothing and thought about a little girl in a red dress who had believed, with her whole small heart, that a deal made in a courtroom was a promise worth keeping. Even if keeping it cost you everything, even then. You just watched a 5-year-old girl walk into a courtroom and give everything she had for someone she loved. She didn't ask for applause. She didn't ask for anything. The only thing this channel is asking is that you hit subscribe before you leave. Debra kept her promise. Can you keep yours?